Today from the global lane, Israel begins a wrap-up in Rafah as Hamas starts an insurgency and Hezbollah intensifies attacks in the north.
Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, these are all terror proxies of Iran. This is the head of the terror octopus. It's the largest state sponsor of terror. I don't think that you're going to have peace in this region until Iran is taken care of.
ISIS unleashed, slaughtering Christians in eastern Congo.
Christians have had to flee, have had to go into hiding in the area. This is not an isolated incident, but this has actually been a trend of an increase in aggressive violence that we've seen.
Federal judges put Joe Biden's new Title IX gender rule on hold.
To expand the definition of sex to include sexual orientation, the Biden administration really got out ahead of itself and acted in a certain way that was not supported by its authority.
And a temporary religious freedom win for Catholics on a government abortion mandate. And it's all right here on the global lane. Wrapping it up in Rafah, the Israeli Defense Forces say it is in the final battles in the war against Hamas in the southern Gaza City. The fight should be completed in a couple more weeks. Well, according to the IDF, half of Hamas's battalions, along with 200 tunnel shafts, have been destroyed in Rafah. Does this now mean Israel will turn its attention to escalating the fight against Hezbollah in the north? Well, joining us is Alex Trayman. He is CEO and Jerusalem Bureau Chief of Jewish News Syndicate. Alex, it's good to have you with us. So what is the IDF facing now in Rafah as it tries to complete the battle there? Is it getting more dangerous or less for them?
Well, every day that the IDF is operating in Rafah, they're justifying the reasons why they needed to go into Rafah. To begin with, they found 25 long tunnels inside Rafah, they're now reporting. But certainly the situation is very dangerous. It's dangerous for a few reasons. Number one, because the IDF has to telegraph exactly where it's going to operate. Once they do that, and they're doing that because of pressure from the Biden administration, then the terrorists know exactly where they're going to be operating, where they're not going to be operating. So the situation is difficult. We lost 11 soldiers in Gaza in the last several days, but the IDF continues to press on, and they believe that they should be wrapping up the operation in Rafah in the coming weeks.
Can they wrap this up when they still have hostages that they haven't rescued yet?
Yeah, it's a big question about the hostages, and we saw how the IDF was able to rescue 4 hostages just over a week ago, but apparently there's not enough intelligence information to figure out where the rest of the hostages are or how to get them back. But Israel also has to turn its attention towards the north because Hezbollah has been escalating attacks, and the IDF is going to need to divert resources to the northern border with Lebanon to deal with Hezbollah in the coming weeks, and they may have to do that even if there are still hostages remaining inside Gaza.
Well, I want to talk about the north in a moment, but just how accurate do you think this estimate is of completing this job in just a couple of weeks?
Well, what they're trying to do is to dismantle the remaining battalions that are inside Rafah. And what dismantling means, according to the IDF, and I guess according to military doctrine in general, is to kill or incapacitate or neutralize 50% of a battalion. So I think that what they mean is that the major operation inside Rafah will be concluded in the coming weeks. But the prime minister has made it clear that the IDF will be present inside Gaza on some level or moving in and out of Gaza at least until the end of the year, if not much longer, because Hamas has changed strategies and they're operating with guerrilla tactics, and there's no way to take out every last terrorist inside the Gaza Strip in such a short amount of time.
So what are you saying? We're already seeing the beginnings of an insurgency?
I believe so. I mean, you're still seeing the major operation, but no question that the IDF is going to have to continue to operate. There are parts of the Gaza Strip that they have not yet gone into. They're finding more and more entrances into this vast tunnel network, and whenever Hamas terrorists will rear their heads, the IDF will have to use surveillance and use intelligence to go back in and to take care of what they find in more limited scale operations.
Okay, back to the north now, taking on Hezbollah in the north. It's going to be a much more difficult task. Why is that, and is Israel prepared for that?
It's a much more difficult task because the weaponry that Hezbollah has been amassing, the size of their army, and the types of rockets that they have is much greater than any threat that Hamas ever posed. You're talking about long-range rockets and missiles with estimates up to 200,000 rockets and missiles, many of them long range, many of them precision guided, many of them that can carry a much more significant payload than the Qassam rockets that Hamas fires in Gaza. We've seen Hezbollah already fire close to 19,000 rockets, anti-tank guided missiles at Israel since October 7th. Just in the last week, several hundred rockets fired, but we haven't yet seen them use the massive weaponry that they have. And what that means is that if the IDF goes in with a ground operation or escalates from its end the attacks, they're going to have to operate very quickly because Hezbollah has the ability to overrun Israeli missile defense systems if they fire in rapid fire. And quite frankly, they could blanket most of the Israeli home front if they decide to do so.
Well, why hasn't more pressure been put on the UN? They're supposed to have a ceasefire zone there as peacekeeping troops in the area protecting Israel from these type of rocket launches. Why aren't they doing their job? Why isn't more pressure being put on them?
Well, the UN is the organization that censures Israel not as much or more than any country in the world, but more than all countries in the world put together. In 2006, Israel negotiated a ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon. The organization UNIFIL, a UN agency, was supposed to come in and force a ceasefire agreement, UN Resolution 1701, to make sure that Hezbollah did not remilitarize in the southern sections of Lebanon. It has been an utter disaster, a national mistake for Israel to rely on UN troops. It's only Israel that can ensure its own security, and Israel is now going to pay the price of trusting the UN to keep peace when clearly they have no ability to do so.
And what reaction is Prime Minister Netanyahu receiving from most Israelis right now after Benny Gantz's resignation and the announcement that he's dissolving the war cabinet?
I don't think that the resignation has much to do with the way Netanyahu conducts the war effort. And most Israelis believe that Netanyahu would conduct the war the same way Benny Gantz would conduct the war. They see Gantz's departure as part of, the political divisions that existed in Israel long before October 7th. Those divisions had escaped, for a few minutes when there was a unity between Netanyahu and Gantz, who's one of his primary challengers. Gantz deciding that Israel needs to go to new elections now. So he's left the war cabinet, he's left the government, but Netanyahu still has a coalition in place. And most Israelis would like to see Netanyahu finish the war effort with a total victory, both in Gaza over Hamas, as well as in Lebanon over Hezbollah.
Okay, so finally, what do you think is going to happen here? Many pro-Israel observers say this war with Hamas and Hezbollah won't be over until you cut off the head of the snake, meaning Iran. So your thoughts on that?
It's hard to predict exactly what's going to happen, but you're correct. Many people incorrectly frame this conflict until now as the latest round of an intractable Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But when you look at what's actually happening, the fact that this attack was by Hamas, that Israel on October 7th began to be attacked as well by Hezbollah, that Houthis in Yemen have been attacking Israel in commercial shipping lanes. Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, these are all terror proxies of Iran. This is the head of the terror octopus. It's the largest state sponsor of terror. This is a war between Israel, Iran, and its proxies. Iran itself has fired over 300 cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones at Israel from its own territory. So I don't think that you're going to have peace in this region until Iran is taken care of. There's a simple formula for transforming the region. That is to normalize relations with moderate actors, as Israel has done with the Emirates, with Bahrain, and is trying to do with Saudi Arabia, and to remove the terror entities, which are Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and the head of that terrorist octopus, which is Iran itself.
Well, a lot of interesting and dangerous days ahead. Alex Trayman, Jewish News Syndicate in Jerusalem. Thank you, Alex, for sharing your time and insights. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Gary, for having me.
ISIS unleashed in the Congo. This week, 80 Christians were killed in a series of attacks in the eastern DRC. In recent years, a group we've told you about before, the ISIS-affiliated Allied Democratic Forces, has launched many attacks against Christians and others in North Kivu province. 1 year ago, they crossed over the border into Uganda and slaughtered 38 Christian children as they slept in their boarding school beds. Well, here to share more is Open Doors U.S. CEO Ryan Brown. Ryan, what more can you tell us about this recent attack and the Christians killed in the DRC? I understand this happened over several days. So where were they? Why were they killed?
Yeah, it did. And I think that the first thing to recognize is that this is not an isolated incident, but this has actually been a trend of an increase in aggressive violence that we've seen towards the church in the eastern DRC. This particular incident kind of reached its pitch, if you will, on the dates of June 4th through June 8th. The culmination on specifically June 7th, where over 40 Christians were killed on that day alone. But over a period of that short window of time, there were well over 80 Christians in that area that were killed. Most of these Christians, this is a season in which many of them are harvesting. And so this impact is not just a short-term impact, but as Christians have had to flee, have had to go into hiding in the area, it's impacted their ability to harvest the crops that they've sown over recent months. And so this will have a long tail, if you will, as far as Christians, not just being threatened in the short term, but also their livelihood being threatened over a longer period of time as well.
And Ryan, this ISIS-affiliated group, the ADF, they're bad news, not only doing this, but also responsible for bombings in Kampala, Uganda. We mentioned that the boarding school attack in Mpangwe about a year ago, the ADF includes remnants of Joseph Kony's Lord's Resistance Army, and that terrorized people in South Sudan and northern Uganda years ago. So what needs to be done to stop them?
Yeah, that's, I think that the first and foremost thing that we always call people to is to pray, to be lifting up, because, anytime the people of God are attacked, it is first and foremost a spiritual issue. And so we do need to be lifting up our brothers and sisters in prayer, be lifting up. There are, forces that, the DRC, as well as some of the Ugandan military are trying to make their presence known within the area, many arguing that they're not doing enough. Former government officials calling out current, asking them to be more vocal and active in the area, trying to curtail the violence. But I think that first and foremost, we need to be praying for our brothers and sisters there, as well as praying for the leaders in these areas, that they will seek to act and seek to speak out against this violence.
Well, I've got to ask you about the elections in India. It didn't go as well as expected for the ruling BJP party and Prime Minister Modi. They're still in power, but weakened by receiving less support. So what does this mean for the Christian minority there? I'm assuming attacks from radical Hindus are likely to continue.
Likely so, yes. In the grand scheme of things, this could very well be good news for Christians in the area. There were many that were expecting from early exit polls, as well as from those currently in power, to see an expansion of the BJA's presence and influence after the election. Prior to the elections, they had held about 303 seats. There were some that were saying that would expand to about 370. And with that expansion, many were expecting that there would be really kind of an unbridled access to the Hindu nationalism just continuing to spread. Even talks of, perhaps a universal anti-conversion law there in India. With this, I think it should be marked that the BJP did not win enough seats to even have the majority of the seats there. By coalition and by partnership, they do have that majority. But again, when there was this expectation and even a fear by some that they would see this greatly expanded influence and control that the BJP would have, to see that being held in check, to see other parties, claiming a greater share of the available seats there, for many Christians, that they are walking away encouraged by those election results.
Okay, and despite all this, the attacks and so forth, we're seeing Christianity spread and grow in India. Ryan Brown, CEO of Open Doors U.S. Always a pleasure, Ryan. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Three judges have blocked President Biden's new Title IX transgender rule from taking effect in 11 states. The rule changes the definition of sex to include gender identity. That means boys who identify as girls and girls who identify as boys could use opposite-sex bathrooms and locker rooms. Well, here to explain the ramifications of these rulings is Sarah Parshall-Perry. She's Senior Legal Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Sarah, this started with two judicial decisions against the Biden rule change, one in Texas, another out of Louisiana, and now a federal judge in the Eastern District of Kentucky. So explain what's going on here.
Yeah, we're not surprised, actually. The minute the rule came out, within 4 weeks, we saw no fewer than 9 federal lawsuits brought by 25 states, a handful of membership organizations, and a few individual plaintiffs, all of whom charging various constitutional law violations, administrative law violations, and civil rights law violations. But we've already seen 3 of the trial court judges, and believe it or not, just recently a divided panel of the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals has also ruled to enjoin what's called informal guidance on Title IX. So it's important because while it is not an injunction on the final rule, it is a statement from these 3 judges at the appellate level, the highest we've seen so far, indicating that, yes, this administration did interpret Title IX in a way that is not supported by its text, by its congressional history, by a plain reading of the law. And in fact, I think we're going to see more outcomes like this before the enforcement date of the rule on August 1st of this year.
Well, the U.S. District Judge in Louisiana said the president overstepped his authority with this rule. How did Biden overstep his bounds? Doesn't the president have the right to set policy for federal departments like education?
He does, but he doesn't have the right to make out of the ether without consulting Congress on it. In fact, we were just reminded by the Supreme Court last term in a case called West Virginia versus EPA that if you are going to make a rule with, quote, broad political and economic impact, you better have pretty clear congressional authority. And to expand the definition of sex to include sexual orientation and gender identity or expression, among others, is a reading of longstanding federal rights law that has never actually been found supported by the text of that particular law. In fact, Congress amended Title IX twice, once in 1975 and another time in 1987, and at no point did Congress ever think that sex should be amended to include gender identity or expression. So this is a reading, really, of longstanding federal civil rights law. It celebrates its 52nd anniversary this month, that has never been expanded in such a way. And I am keen to think that the Supreme Court, once faced with this kind of a case, is going to determine, as it did in the West Virginia versus EPA case, that the Biden administration really got out ahead of itself and acted in a certain way that was not supported by its authority.
Well, Sarah, these judicial decisions only affect 11 states at this point. I guess most of our viewers want to know, what does this mean for them and their children?
Well, understanding that half the states in the country, 25 of them, have already challenged this rule, and understanding that now we have 11 that are shielded until an appeal from the Biden administration, it's actually good news. And it indicates that in this fast-moving area of litigation, it is very likely that we are going to see the Supreme Court make a determination on this, at least on an emergency basis, sooner as opposed to later. Now, we are coming to the end of the Supreme Court term. We will probably reach into the first few days of July, but it would not surprise me if we see on something called the shadow docket or the rocket docket, if it's as it's sometimes colloquially called, the Supreme Court making a very brief emergency determination that a law should be enjoined, it should be paused, while the merits of the underlying litigation go forward. So that's good news goes to state and local education associations that want to follow the law, they have air cover now to be able to say, listen, this law, this rule is tied up deeply in litigation. It is in our best interest not to make any change because we might invest taxpayer funding to expand facilities, open up bathrooms, install, for example, urinals in the girls' restroom that we might have to actually go back and ultimately undo. So as far as we're concerned, this is a good way to say it's time to press pause on this illegal interpretation of the law.
So Supreme Court probably intervene soon or take a case soon on this?
We may see a temporary pause from the Supreme Court while the underlying litigation takes place on the merits, and that sort of battle of the textualists versus anti-textualists in federal law takes place, and we'll see whether or not, in the end, whether or not they come out the victors, as we believe that they will.
Okay, Sarah Parshall-Perry, Senior Legal Fellow of the Heritage Foundation. Thank you, Sarah, for sharing your time and insights. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
There was good news this week for religious freedom. A federal judge in Louisiana has blocked the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission from mandating that a group of Catholic ministries accommodate employee abortions. The EEOC required employers, including faith ministries, to give employees paid leave so they could have abortions. The commission also demanded that life-affirming workplace policies discouraging abortion be dismantled. Whatever happened to freedom of religion and free speech? I guess the EEOC believes the U.S. Constitution doesn't apply to them. The case is ongoing. However, the federal court ruled in the meantime that Catholic ministries backed by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops must be protected from the government mandate. Folks, the court got it right. This is another example of government overreach and government bureaucrats trying to impose their unconstitutional extremist views on pro-life Americans. Do you recall when the Little Sisters of the Poor were fined $100 per day per employee for refusing to provide insurance coverage for contraceptives and abortion pills? The U.S. Supreme Court rejected the government's imposition of those fines on the Catholic ministry.
This is a victory for all Americans, because the principle of religious freedom applies to everyone, and a government that's big enough to restrict religious freedom is a government that can do anything.
This U.S. Catholic bishop's case is likely to produce a similar outcome. Well, that's it today from the Global Lane. Be sure to follow us on the CBN News and NRB channels and our broadcast affiliates. And until next time, be blessed.